very common way of interacting with Azure is through the command line. Now, as I mentioned, you have complete API access that's wrapped up in SDKs across different languages, so you can write your own code to manage Azure. But oftentimes, you're simply not going to need that because we have powerful client tools. And the one we're going to focus on is PowerShell. Okay? And you've got Azure PowerShell modules that you can download and that are available to interact with Azure. Now, if you are familiar with PowerShell, the concept of commandlets, and these are very purpose-built functional commands that are part of PowerShell, right? And whereas with, say, a traditional command line operation in the Windows environment, I might have one command line application and I use all kinds of switches to make that one command line tool do everything, right? With PowerShell, you have commandlets that do specific things. So if I want to create a virtual machine, for example, that's going to use one commandlet. If I want to update a virtual machine, that's going to use a different commandlet. And certainly if I want to work with, services, web applications, that's going to be a different set of commandlets. So you have all of these commandlets that perform different operations against the Azure environment. And because it's PowerShell, first of all, it's very scriptable. So if I wanted to write scripts and then be able to repeat those scripts, you can certainly do that very easily using PowerShell scripting. So you can automate that way, okay? But you don't have to go fully into like writing custom applications for it. So it's a nice thing. Now, one thing to note, and this is kind of down here as almost a side note, but it is really, really critical, okay? The PowerShell environment supports both the version 1 classic Azure Services Management Model, and it also supports the Azure Resource Management Model, or ARM model. So you have ASM support and ARM support. In Azure, or in PowerShell, they're differentiated by a completely parallel set, or not quite parallel, but certainly completely separate set of PowerShell commandlets. And they would be separate because some of the things that you're going to do in the service management model are going to be different than some of the things you're going to do in the resource management model. And they're differentiated. We're going to look at the ones for the service management model in the following topics. And I'll show you how you can differentiate and tell whether you're interacting with the service management model or the resource management model. But that is something to understand. One thing to note, and one other thing to note, this is really useful and important to know, this guy down here, features are often implemented in PowerShell before they're implemented in the portal. Okay? And in fact, the order is functionality is first implemented at the API level, then it's added to the PowerShell tools and the possibly cross-platform client tools, then it's added into the portal. Now, don't worry too much about that because by and large, most of the functionality is added into the portal before that functionality is released for what's called general availability. All right, you have kind of two different, well, there's really a few variations of it, but two different statuses of functionality in Azure. The first is preview functionality, and that's essentially beta functionality, to use older terms. All right, and then you have general availability, which is release. All right, and usually when things are in general availability, they're going to have an entry in the portal of some sort. But I will tell you, there's functionality that may never get into the portal that you can work with through PowerShell. Just a quick example of this that I run into a lot on the administrative side. If I'm creating virtual machines and I want a virtual machine to have multiple NICs, so it can have what we used to call multi-home machine, I have to use the command line to do that, or the API, but there's no interface for that within the portal. Okay, so a lot of, if you can do it in the portal, great. If you want to do something that you think is part of Azure and you don't see it in the portal, then you need to look to PowerShell. Probably going to be there. If not, look into the API because you may need to write something custom. But probably, by and large, anything you need to do, you're going to be able to do through PowerShell.